Researchers about the December 7, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor know that President Franklin Roosevelt provoked a Japanese attack to justify America's entry into World War II. Japanese footage of the attack is seen here. Most Americans were against joining the war, but the attack on Pearl Harbor provided the excuse needed to declare war. The best book on this topic is Day of Deceit by former World War II Navy officer Robert Stinnett. The topics he covers are controversial because most people refuse to accept that Roosevelt and top military leaders in Washington, D.C. failed to inform the commanders in Hawaii that a Japanese fleet was coming to attack and restricted operations to ensure its success. Part 1 of The Attack on Pearl Harbor Was No Surprise is linked below. It explains the dismissal of the admiral in charge of the Pacific Fleet because he kept insisting that his fleet return to San Diego because it was vulnerable to a surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. It shows the Flying Tigers were secretly funded and ready for combat just as Pearl Harbor occurred, and the 4th Marine Regiment was withdrawn from China just days before war began. The intercept of a Japanese coded diplomatic message on December 4th instructed its embassy and consulates in the United States to destroy all secret documents and coding machines. In addition, the Japanese fleet was tracked en route to Hawaii when it was forced to send radio messages to reassemble after it hit a typhoon. Finally, Part 1 describes the odd deployment of the 2 aircraft carriers and all the newest destroyers and cruisers out of Pearl Harbor a few days prior to the attack, leaving behind old World War I-era ships. 5 U.S. Navy battleships were sunk, and 5 others were damaged. The Japanese also sank or damaged 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, a trading ship, and 1 mine layer. 188 U.S. aircraft were destroyed, 2,702 personnel killed, and 1,282 wounded. Japanese losses were light, with 47 aircraft and 5 midget submarines lost, and 65 servicemen killed or wounded. Part 1 provides ample evidence that the attack on Pearl Harbor was no surprise, and there is more proof. One official myth is that admirals thought the Japanese were incapable of attacking distant Pearl Harbor. In fact, they knew that a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was likely. The Japanese had launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur in 1904. The U.S. Navy conducted fleet exercises testing Hawaiian defenses in 1928, 1932, 1934, 1937, 1938, and 1940. The largest was the 1932 Grand Joint Army-Navy exercise. U.S. Navy Rear Admiral Harry Yarnell sent 2 aircraft carriers from San Diego with 152 planes to attack Hawaii just before dawn from 40 miles northeast of Kahuku Point. He caught the defenders of Pearl Harbor completely by surprise. As a result of these exercises, U.S. Navy admirals considered a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor likely should Japan choose war. President Roosevelt was presented with recommendations to provoke war with Japan, known as the McCullum Memo. Action D involved the deliberate deployment of American warships into territorial waters of Japan. Robert Stinnett documented that President Roosevelt approved these intrusions, saying, quote, "I want them popping up here and there. I don't want to lose 5 or 6 cruisers, but I don't mind losing 1 or 2. These so-called pop-up cruises were opposed by the new chief of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Husband Kimmel, who warned that these were, quote, "ill-advised and will result in war if we make this move." White House records show that President Roosevelt ordered 3 pop-up cruisers in 1941, sending ships far into Japanese waters. The most provocative was a sortie into the Bungo Strait, southeast of Honshu, on the night of July 31st, 1941. The USS Salt Lake City, shown here, was the flagship on that mission. This was a training area for the Japanese Navy, who tracked the 2 American cruisers but did not attack. This would be like Japanese cruisers sailing into San Francisco Bay for a couple of hours. During all three intrusions, the Japanese did not take the bait and just sent diplomatic protests. Stinnett added important information about Japanese naval officer Takeo Yokishiwa, a spy who worked out of the Japanese consulate in Honolulu. Hawaii was a favored location for Japanese diplomatic personnel, so positions were filled by older men with seniority. The arrival of a young Japanese man in March 1941 was suspicious. The FBI checked and learned that he was not listed in the Japanese Foreign Registry, so they put a tail on him as he scouted Pearl Harbor and Hawaiian airfields. He began sending messages to Tokyo about U.S. Navy ships and aircraft using the Japanese diplomatic code that the Americans could read. Starting in August 1941, Yoshikawa began sending the exact berthing location of each ship, something valuable only if the Japanese were planning an attack. FBI reports were sent to Washington, D.C., but were never shared with military commanders in Hawaii, nor were the decoded messages. An inexplicable event just prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor was a refusal to implement war plans when ordered. The United States official war plan for World War II was called War Plan Orange, or WPL 67. That was approved in July 1941. The detailed plan for the Pacific Fleet is linked below, which directed the Pacific Fleet to deploy from Hawaii to protect American naval bases at Guam, Samoa, and Wake Island. Chapter 4 of War Plan Orange states, quote, "At the date of issue of this plan, the U.S. Pacific Fleet is virtually mobilized and is operating with intensive security measures from the Pearl Harbor base. It is expected, therefore, that a major portion of the fleet can be ready for active service within 4 days of an order for general mobilization." The Pacific Fleet was known to be vulnerable to attack at Pearl Harbor. On November 27th, 10 days before the Japanese attack, the Chief of Naval Operations issued a war warning that, quote, "an aggressive move by Japan is expected within the next few days." He ordered, quote, "execute an appropriate defensive deployment preparatory to the carrying out of tasks assigned in WPL 46. This was a clear order to deploy the fleet to carry out War Plan Orange. If allowed 4 days, ships should have departed Pearl Harbor by December 2nd. They could have deployed northward in case Hawaii was a target, dispersed southward safe from attack, or westward to execute the war plan. But the ships remained in port and were not even on alert on December 7th as shore leave was allowed. Obviously, some senior people conspired to keep many older ships in port as targets. Stinnett documents that Admiral Royal Ingersoll issued a vacant sea order on November 22nd that forced commercial ships to transit south of Hawaii. This kept them out of the path of the approaching Japanese fleet and ensured no radio warnings could be made. On November 25th, he ordered the withdrawal of U.S. Navy ships patrolling north of Hawaii. This was later explained as a defensive measure, since ships in that area would be vulnerable to attack should war occur. However, this does not explain why no patrol planes were dispatched northward each morning to scout for Japanese ships after the November 27th war warning. The Army had several long-range B-17 bombers that could patrol. The U.S. Navy had 72 PBY-5 flying boats based in Hawaii with a range of 2,000 miles specifically to patrol the ocean. On the morning of December 7th, 11 PBIs were at Midway, 54 were flight-ready in Hawaii, and 5 were airborne. See the link below. Documents reveal that one PBY dropped depth charges on a Japanese midget submarine attempting to enter Pearl Harbor early on December 7th. But why was it patrolling less than 1 mile from its base on Ford Island? What happened to the other 4 patrol aircraft? They should have been scouting north of Hawaii that morning and would have encountered the massive Japanese fleet and radioed a warning. The only explanation is that someone banned air patrols north of Hawaii too. Stinnett speculates that some admirals played a role in Roosevelt's plot. After the war, famous American Admiral William Halsey blamed the American people for the Pearl Harbor disaster. In his autobiography, Admiral Halsey's Story, he stated that the defeat was caused by a lack of funding, not political treachery. Halsey wrote, quote, "Who then is to blame? Look at it logically. The attack succeeded because Admiral Kimmel and General Short could not give Pearl Harbor adequate protection. They could not give it because they did not have it to give. They did not have it because Congress would not authorize it. Congress is elected by the American people, and the blame for Pearl Harbor rests squarely on the American people and nowhere else."